Now that we have understanding of the attributes, what are the different types of floating and integer data types of these attributes are, now let's put these attributes into action, into use. Okay, so how we can leverage these attributes. For that, let's say if I want to drive the extrusion of the geometry. So maybe in here I just need create a grid in here. Let's create a very simple example. Here we have the grid and we have these different primitives. Let's say if I want to extrude the primitive, so I can create the extrusion. If I enable the selection tool, I can select any primitive, and when the primitive is selected, I can bring up my node menu and I can type poly extrude and hit enter. And here we have this manipulator and I can click and drag to drive the extrusion. And if I go into my node editor, network view, and here as you can see, I have created a poly extrude node. Let me activate my view tool. Let's enable the parameter of our poly extrude. And here as you can see, onto the group tool, we have selected the primitive number, 40. So we are extruding the primitive number 40 by this value. I can change this inset value. That's how the basic extrusion work. I can remove this group menu in here. Okay, what that will do, it will just extrude whole geometry up. And here as you can see, if I adjust these settings, let me play around with the inset, and here as you can see, all of our primitive, if nothing is selected, all of our these grid primitives has been extruded upward. So what if I were to create a attribute and drive the extrusion? Okay, because right now we were just extruding everything upward. So let's see how we can do that. First, I'm going to create a attribute. So in here, I'm going to create an attribute create node, and let me connect this in here. And because I want to drive the extrusion of the primitive, so we need to create a primitive attribute. Okay, so onto the class, let's change this to primitive, and I'm going to rename this one my attrib. Let's rename this my attrib, and in here, let's say I want to extrude my all of these primitive into one unit into the y. So that is a maybe let's change this to 1 right now, because I think because we are going to drive our this poly extrude value. Let me add this with this one. So I want to drive this parameter with our this my attribute. So because it has an a1 value and it's a floating value. It's a floating value because we have some fractional part 0.118. So which means we need the a float attribute. So in here, I'm keeping the value to 1. I can change this to 0.5, and I can go into the geometry spreadsheet onto the primitive. Here as you can see, we have a value of 0.5. And in here, let's connect this and view this. And right now, here as you can see, we are using this to drive the extrusion. But what I like to do, I like to drive this parameter with my attrib. Okay, so what I can do, I can go into the poly extrude node, and let's go into the local control. And onto the local control, we have these options for the local attributes, which mean we can use the attributes to drive these parameters. So at the first, here as you can see, we have this one, this distance, and here as you can see, we have the distance attribute. So let's enable this. And in here, we need to define the name. And by default, it's set to Z scale, which means that it's expecting the Z scale attribute on our primitive. But in here, we have created our attribute name my attrib. So let's go into the poly extrude. And in here, I'm going to just rename this to the attribute that I like to use. And I like to use the my attrib attribute. So let's add this. Let's type the name in here. And now here as you can see, we have some extrusion. And Now this value will become as an a multiplier. Okay, so this value will going to be multiplied by this our 0.5. So what I like to do, I like to change this to all the way up to 1, which mean that we are just going to use this value because now the multiplier is 1, so which mean everything is equal to this. So which mean I can just come over here and I can adjust this value. And now here you can see I'm using this attribute to drive my extrusion. And right now it has a uniform value. Okay, so nothing interesting is going on in here because we are just using the uniform value for all of our these extrusion. If we go into the geometry spreadsheet, and here you can see all of these primitives get the same value 1.09. Now let's randomize this attribute. I want to create some random extrusion. To actually randomize this attribute on per primitive basis, we have a node called attribute randomize. So let's add an attribute randomize node in here. And in here we need to define the attribute name. Right now it's randomizing the CD. So what CD is a color attribute. It stands for color diffuse. It's also the case sensitive, the uppercase C and lowercase t. If I were to just connect this, and here you can see that will give us a random color, and that is because we are randomizing the color. And if I middle mouse button, and here you can see we have a point attribute CD. So CD will produce the color in our geometry. If I create a color attribute in here, and let me remove this node by shaking off, and let's add this node in here. And by adding the color here, I can define the color. I can pick any color that I like, let's say blue color. And here you can see if I middle mouse button, here we have a CD. So CD is color. This attribute is the attribute that Houdini understand to set up the geometry color. And right now it is a point attribute. When we were creating this attribute randomize, it will creating the CD and also randomizing its value. That's why we get this rainbow looking color. But I want to randomize my attribute, this attribute that we have just created. Let me copy this attribute, and let's go into the attribute randomize, and onto the attribute name, let's paste our attribute that we want to randomize, my attribute. And now if I go into my geometry spreadsheet, and here you can see my attribute has not been randomized, and that is because the attribute class is set to point, but we have the primitive attribute. So let's change this to primitive. And here as you can see we have these random values. I can change the distribution to change the randomness, and here we have quite a lot of option. So we have this one uniform continuous, and we have this also option for exponential. And here as you can see we have all of these random my attribute on per primitive basis. Here we have these primitive number. So the primitive number 50 will get an extrusion value of 0.9, and primitive 49 will get the value of 2.6. So let's see how this random extrusion looks. So let's go back into our scene view, and here you can see it looks the same. And that is because we need to go into the poly extrude, and let's go into our this. Let me find here extrusion mode, divide into. Right now it says connected components because all of the geometry is connected, so this extrusion is just not working correctly. So let's change this to divide into individual elements because we want to extrude individually all of these primitives. So onto the divide into, let's change this to individual elements. And now here as you can see we get some random extrusion value. So which mean now I can go into my this attribute randomize, and in here I can play around with these limit. Here we have the min limit and max limit. I can play around that minimum extrusion value, how much the minimum value it should generate. I can define the max value, or I can maybe let's change this to something else. Maybe let's change this to custom ramp. And now we can use this ramp to randomize our this attribute to create our this random extrusion. So here we have the minimum value and that is the maximum value. So that is an a per primitive randomized extrusion that is only possible with the use of attribute. We can copy and paste all of our setup in here. So if let's remove this attribute create, I can just select all three nodes and just click and drag, and let's connect them in here. And here you can see, let me escape that and select this node and organize them and zoom in, and here you can see now we have the random extrusion going on our this geometry. Maybe the scale is too big, so we can go into the poly extrude, and here you can see that is a multiplier, so which means I can just lower this down to multiply my overall extrusion. And here you can see we have this random extrusion because all of the setup is procedural. So first we are creating the attribute, maybe let's change the value to 1. And in here we are using the attribute randomize to randomize our this extrusion attribute, and into the poly extrude we are using this attribute to drive the extrusion. Let me break this down even further if you do not have currently understand how this working. So onto the attribute randomize, let me remove this attribute randomize node, and first onto the my attribute, here we are creating the attribute for all of our primitives the same value. All right, so if we go into the scene view and if I enable the primitive number, and here as you can see we have this primitive number right now. They are starting like this. Let me arrange this. So we have the primitive number 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they are going like so. Okay, 9, 10, 11. All of these we have these primitive numbers. So let's say if I want to create a random attribute on my own onto the primitive number 41. So what I can do, I can type onto the group name in here the primitive number. I'm going to type primitive 41, so which is that primitive, and I'm going to setting the value of 1.1. So if I go into my geometry spreadsheet and onto the primitive, and let me find the primitive number 41. So let me find where. Okay, so 42, it says 42. Sorry, I have typed 42 in here. So 42, we have the value of 1.1, and all of these primitive will get a value of 0. So I can keep creating this my attribute. Let me duplicate this attribute create node and let's connect this down the line. And for this one, so I accidentally typed 42. Now let's type the 41. So let's type 41 in here, and I'm going to assign the value of 0.5 this time. So now if we go into the geometry spreadsheet and let me find the primitive 41 and 42. There we have. The 41 primitive will get a value of 0.5, 42 get 1.1. And I can keep creating this my attribute, and let me connect this. And for this one, I'm going to store the value for the primitive 0. So in here, I'm going to type the primitive number and I'm going to type some random value, let's say 0.35 maybe. And here you can see the primitive number will get that value. And let's keep creating them. And for this one, maybe I'm going to assign the value to primitive number 11. So onto the primitive 11, this one maybe get a value of 0.8. And let me find. And here as you can see, we have a value of 0.48 for the primitive 11. Now let's go back. And now let's use the poly extrude. Let's see how the poly extrude is working. Let me hide the primitive number and let's view. And here as you can see, all of the primitives that has the values will get the same extrusion. So which means I can go back, and here I have control. Let's say if I want to adjust the extrusion for the primitive 11, I can just come over here and play around with this value. And here as you can see, I can individually control my extrusion. I can go back to the primitive number 0 and let's play around with the extrusion value. Let's go back onto the maybe primitive number 41 and let's adjust this. So basically that's the manual way of creating and assigning the attribute, and what the attribute randomized node is doing, it's automating all of these tasks for us. It's just taking the attribute, the my attrib, and assigning them a random value. And here as you can see, here we have the number of primitives and we have the corresponding values. And polyextrude will use these values to drive the extrusion. So let me view this once more. That's how these attributes work.